I wasn't looking for a conspiracy when I started pulling on this thread. I was looking for an explanation. Something simple, something that would satisfy the itch that started when I came across a single line in an old New England journal, a line that said, matter-of-factly, as if reporting on nothing stranger than rain, that on May 19, 1780, the sun ceased to exist. Not dimmed, not clouded over, ceased. Gone by midday, candles lit at noon, livestock retreating to their barns, children crying in the streets because they thought with genuine bone-deep terror that the world was ending. And when you read the original accounts, not the sanitized encyclopedia summaries, not the footnotes in climate science papers, but the actual words of the people who lived through it, you start to feel it too, that creeping wrongness, that sense that what you're being told doesn't quite fit what actually happened. The official explanation is forest fires, smoke from burning woodland carried by unusual wind patterns across New England and parts of Canada, natural, localized, unremarkable, the kind of explanation designed to end questions rather than answer them. But I didn't want the explanation to end. Because when I kept reading, when I pushed past the official summary into the actual historical record, I found that May 19, 1780 isn't an isolated curiosity. It's a doorway. And behind that doorway is something that official history has spent 2 centuries trying to convince us was never there. A civilization. Vast, global, sophisticated, and gone. Gone in a window of time so narrow, so abrupt, so suspiciously well papered over, that the absence itself becomes the evidence. This is the story of the dark day, and this is the story of what it might have been hiding. Part 1, The Day the Sky Died. Let's start with what we actually know. May 19, 1780, New England, Eastern Canada. By mid-morning the sky begins to change, not the slow grey thickening of ordinary overcast, something different. Something that multiple witnesses across hundreds of miles describe with almost identical language. A wall, a curtain, a darkness that arrives rather than descends. By noon, it is night. Complete, impenetrable, the kind of darkness where you cannot see your hand extended in front of your face. The Connecticut state legislature is in session when it hits. Candles are brought. Some members call for adjournment because they cannot see across the chamber. Others argue they should stay at their posts precisely because no one knows what is happening. Colonel Abraham Davenport, in what would become one of the most quoted speeches of the event, says he is not in favor of adjournment. If this is the last day of the world, he says, he intends to be found doing his duty. Read that again. A sitting legislator in 1780 publicly entertains the possibility that the world might be ending, not as hyperbole, as a genuine calculation for how he should spend what might be his remaining hours. That's not how people respond to smoke. Timothy Dwight, future president of Yale, was present in the region and documented the event extensively. His accounts describe the darkness as unlike anything in natural philosophy, by which he means science. He notes its sudden arrival, its depth, and most significantly, its quality. There is something about the air during the dark day that witnesses struggle to articulate, a presence, a weight, a quality that goes beyond mere absence of light. Samuel Williams, a Harvard professor who makes the most rigorous contemporary scientific study of the event, calculates the affected area at over 150,000 square miles. He documents the red and copper tint at the edges of the darkness, the blood-red moon that rises that night, the oily quality of rainwater collected during the event, rain that leaves a dark, soot-like residue when it evaporates. He concludes it was likely forest fires. But read his actual documentation. His conclusion reads like a man who doesn't fully believe his own answer, like someone who looked at the evidence, looked at what the evidence suggested, looked at what that would mean, and chose the safer interpretation. 150,000 square miles. Let me give you some context for that number. The Great Fire of London in 1666, one of the most catastrophic urban fires in recorded history, burned approximately 373 acres. Even a genuinely massive forest fire, the kind that generates its own weather systems, the kind we see in the western United States with modern ignition conditions, typically affects an area measured in tens of thousands of acres, not hundreds of thousands of square miles. For forest fire smoke to darken 150,000 square miles to complete midday blackout, you would need a fire of almost incomprehensible scale, and you would expect that fire to be documented, extensively, by a literate, observational, record-keeping society that documented everything from weather patterns to the price of cod. There are no such records. No records of a fire massive enough to produce what happened on May 19, 1780. So the explanation requires a fire large enough to do the impossible, that left behind no documentation of its existence. That's not an explanation, that's a placeholder. Part 2, the name that disappeared. Here's where the investigation pivots. I want you to open any major European atlas from 1750. Dutch, French, British, doesn't matter. Find the vast territories stretching across what we now call Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, and the regions east of the Ural Mountains. Look at what they're labeled. Tartaria or Tartary depending on the publisher. Grand Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The designations vary but the name persists. It's there on Bliu's atlas. It's there on Mercator's maps. It's there on Moll's geography, on Danville's cartography, in the Encyclopaedia Britannica's first edition of 1771, which devotes a substantial entry to Tartary as a region of significant extent and complexity. The 1771 Britannica describes Tartary as a vast country in the northern parts of Europe and Asia, extending from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. That's not a vague geographic label. That's a description of a territory the size of multiple modern nations combined, understood well enough to describe its borders, its extent, its relationship to surrounding powers. Now open a major European atlas from 1820. The name is fading. By 1850, it's nearly gone. By 1870, you have to look hard to find any trace of it. The territory it once described is now divided up and relabeled under Russian imperial designations, Qing dynasty names, and the vague catch-all category of unexplored regions. The Britannica, in its later 19th century editions, has drastically reduced its treatment of Tartary. By the early 20th century, it's a historical curiosity, a relic term, something that old maps used before we knew better. This is the official story. Tartary was never a nation or a civilization. It was a vague geographic term, derived from the Mongol and Turkic peoples Europeans called Tartars, applied broadly and imprecisely to a region that European cartographers didn't fully understand. As exploration and imperial expansion provided better information, the vague term was replaced with accurate ones: natural cartographic evolution. That explanation sounds reasonable, until you look at how cartographic knowledge actually evolved in the 18th century. When European mapmakers corrected errors, when they refined their understanding of a region, they documented the process. They noted in marginalia and accompanying texts which sources they were using, which surveys they were updating from, what the previous understanding had been, and why it was being revised. Cartographic revision was a scholarly act, done in public with citations. For Tartary, none of this exists. The name doesn't get corrected. It doesn't get replaced with a careful note explaining that this broad term has been superseded by more specific designations following surveys conducted by such and such expedition in such and such year. It just fades, quietly, consistently, across multiple publishers in multiple countries simultaneously. That's not correction, that's erasure. And it happens in the same narrow window as the Dark Day. 1776, American independence. New nation, new narrative, new maps. 1780, the Dark Day, the sky goes black. 1780 to 1820, Tartary systematically disappears from European and American cartography. The timing isn't a footnote, it's the entire question. Part 3, the architecture that shouldn't exist. If you want to understand why the Tartaria question won't go away, why it keeps pulling in researchers and independent historians and curious people who stumble on it from entirely unrelated directions, you have to look at the buildings. Not the Colosseum, not the Parthenon. Not the ancient wonders that we've had centuries to study and explain. I mean the buildings from the 19th century. The buildings we're told were built between approximately 1780 and 1880. The ones we're told represent the triumph of industrial age construction, of human ingenuity and ambition, of the neoclassical revival movement that supposedly swept the entire Western world and significant portions of Asia simultaneously. Look at them carefully. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, the St. Louis Union Station, the U.S. Capitol, not the building we're taught it is but the one that appears in photographs from the 1860s, the old Executive Office Building in Washington, the Philadelphia City Hall, the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne, Australia, the grand railway stations of Europe, the public libraries, the opera houses, the municipal buildings that dot the centers of cities from Buenos Aires to St. Petersburg. Now ask a simple question: where are the construction photographs? Photography was invented in the 1830s. By the 1840s it was being used commercially. By the 1850s, photographic documentation was commonplace. By the 1860s, the American Civil War was being documented in exhaustive visual detail. Thousands of photographs of battlefields, hospitals, soldiers, encampments. For the construction of the major civic buildings of the 19th century, photographs are nearly non-existent. We have photographs of the completed buildings. We have dedication ceremonies, opening galas, official inaugural portraits. We have paintings sometimes of the construction, but photographs of the actual building process, of the scaffolding, of the stone being quarried, transporting, lifted into place, of the workforce of thousands that would have been required. Almost nothing. The official answer is that construction sites weren't considered photogenic subjects, that photographers focused on events and people rather than processes, that the documentation was primarily written, and we simply haven't preserved it all. But that answer collapses under the weight of a single example. The construction of the Crystal Palace for London's Great Exhibition of 1851 is one of the most extensively documented construction projects in human history. We have blueprints, supply manifests, workforce records, cost ledgers, eyewitness accounts from dozens of journalists who reported on progress week by week, and yes, photographs. So 19th century photographers could document construction when they wanted to. They just didn't want to document the construction of the most impressive buildings of the era. And when you start looking at the buildings themselves, at the physical evidence rather than the written history, the questions deepen. These buildings are built to a standard that defies their supposed construction timeline. The stonework, the proportions, the acoustic design of the great halls, the underground infrastructure, the drainage systems, the foundations, that in many cases extend far deeper and follow far more sophisticated engineering principles than anything else being built at the same time. The ornamental detail carved into stone with a precision that would be difficult to achieve today, and that we're supposed to believe was accomplished by hand by workers with 19th century tools working under 19th century conditions. And they're everywhere. Melbourne was a colonial outpost in the 1850s, a rough settlement, growing fast, wealthy from gold but raw new frontier in its character. Within 2 decades it supposedly constructed public buildings that rival the great halls of Europe, buildings that would require hundreds of skilled craftsmen, years of labor, and supply chains that simply didn't exist in 1850s Victoria. Chicago erected an entire exposition city in roughly 2 years for the 1893 World's Fair. 14 major buildings, hundreds of structures, a functioning city with electricity, plumbing, railways, and architecture that astonished every visitor, including the most sophisticated Europeans who attended. We are told it was built largely from scratch by 40,000 workers using plast-on-steel frame construction, and that it was demolished afterward. But the photographs of the fair don't look like plaster. They look like stone. They look like permanence. And the official explanation for why it doesn't exist anymore: it burned down. The White City, as it was called, was largely consumed by fires after the fair closed. Convenient. Here's the pattern. Buildings of impossible sophistication appear fully formed during the inheritance period. When they're demolished or damaged, it's by fire. When they're documented, it's the finished product, not the process. And the official narrative of their construction is supported by records written decades later, not contemporary documentation. What if they didn't build those buildings? What if they found them? Part 4. What happened between 1780 and 1820? Let's map the inheritance period in detail. Because when you lay out what was happening simultaneously across the supposedly unconnected civilizations of the world in the 4 decades following the Dark Day, the pattern that emerges is not one of independent development. It's one of coordinated acquisition. Russia under Catherine the Great and her successors rapidly expands eastward into territories previously designated on maps as Tartary. The expansion is documented as military and diplomatic conquest, but the record of what exactly was conquered, who was living there, how many, how they resisted or were absorbed, is curiously thin. We have accounts of battles and treaties, but almost no social documentation of the populations being absorbed, no ethnographies of displaced peoples, no records of languages being suppressed. The Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia is treated in official history as the settlement of largely empty land. But you cannot label a territory on every map in Europe for 3 centuries and then explain its acquisition as the settlement of empty land. Something was there. Simultaneously, the newly founded United States begins its westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubles the nation's size overnight. What is acquired is described officially as wilderness, as territory, as land populated only by native peoples who are categorically excluded from the historical consideration of what was on this land before European settlement. But across this wilderness are found repeatedly, by the first European American settlers who document their travels, ruins, earthworks, mounds of enormous scale, structures that predate any known native civilization and that the emerging American archaeological establishment quickly categorizes, fences off, and then largely stops discussing. The Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. At its peak, Cahokia was larger than London. Its main pyramid, Monk's Mound, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Official history acknowledges it existed and then places it comfortably in the pre-Columbian period and stops asking questions. What if Cahokia wasn't pre-Columbian? What if it was simply pre-American? What if the civilization that built it was still present, still functioning, still appearing on European maps under a different name, as recently as the 1770s? Europe, meanwhile, is undergoing its own strange transformation. The neoclassical movement sweeps the continent with a speed and uniformity that defies the usual patterns of artistic evolution. Style doesn't usually work this way. Movements don't emerge simultaneously in France, England, Prussia, Russia, and the Italian states with identical vocabulary, identical proportions, identical decorative grammar. Style diffuses from a center. It takes time. It gets interpreted, adapted, mixed with local traditions. The neoclassical revival of the late 18th and early 19th century behaves as if it has no center because it's not a movement at all. It's recognition. The architects and builders of the inheritance period aren't inventing a new style. They're describing what they found. They're labeling what was already standing. The revival of classical forms isn't a revival, it's an attribution. We found buildings, we called them ours. We hired artists to paint their construction. We hired writers to chronicle their dedication. We created a history of their building that never actually happened. And we needed a name for the style, so we called it classical. We called it a revival. We invented a lineage back to Greece and Rome that conveniently skipped the 1,000 years of the medieval period during which, supposedly, all architectural sophistication was lost before being miraculously recovered in the 18th century. The Renaissance and the neoclassical revival are not revivals. They are the moments when a new civilization begins to understand and then claim the ruins it has inherited. Part 5, The Silence of the Scholars. This is the part that troubles me most. If the Tartaria question is simply the product of misreading maps, of conspiracy-minded pattern recognition applied to coincidental data, then it should be easy to debunk. Thoroughly, with evidence, historians should be able to point to the construction records for the major buildings of the 19th century. Archaeologists should be able to show the population continuity in Central Asia. Cartographers should be able to explain precisely why and how the name Tartary was retired, and what documentary evidence supports the replacement of that label. These things should be easy. They're not easy. I have spent considerable time looking for them, not looking for evidence of Tartaria, looking for the debunking, looking for the solid, sourced, documented refutation, and what I find instead is dismissal. The Tartaria theory, such as official academic discourse acknowledges it at all, is dismissed as a modern internet conspiracy theory, rooted in misreading of historical maps, in cherry-picking atmospheric events, in confirmation bias applied to architectural history. The dismissal is confident. The dismissal is sometimes contemptuous. But the dismissal almost never engages with the actual questions. Where are the construction records for the great civic buildings of the 1800s? Where is the documentation of the population transition in the territories formerly labeled Tartary? Why did the name disappear without cartographic explanation? What caused the atmospheric events of 1780 to 1785? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine historical inquiries with answers that, if the official narrative is correct, should be accessible, should be straightforward, should have been answered long ago. Instead, what we get is institutional silence, occasionally broken by ridicule. And ridicule in the history of suppressed truths has always functioned as a tool of control, not the ridicule of careful refutation, the ridicule of social pressure, the ridicule that says, if you take this seriously, you've already disqualified yourself from serious conversation. That kind of ridicule doesn't prove anything, it only tells you where the sensitive nerve is. Ask why Tartaria disappeared from maps, not as a conspiracy theorist, but as a serious student of cartographic history, and watch what happens. The conversation ends. The topic is changed. You're handed a reference to a Wikipedia article that describes Tartary as a vague geographic term and never engages with the specific questions of why it appeared on maps for centuries and then vanished in decades without explanation. The silence of the scholars is not evidence of Tartaria's existence, but it is evidence that the questions make the establishment uncomfortable in a way that genuine lack of evidence shouldn't. If there were nothing to find, there would be nothing to suppress. The silence says something is there. Part 6, the atmospheric record. Let's go back to the sky. Because the dark day of 1780 is not alone. It's not a single anomaly. It's the most dramatic point in a cluster of atmospheric events that, taken together, paint a picture that natural disaster theory cannot adequately explain. 1780, the dark day, New England and eastern Canada, complete midday darkness across 150,000 square miles. 1783, the Laki eruption in Iceland. This one is real, documented, undeniable. A volcanic fissure eruption of extraordinary scale, one of the largest in recorded history. It releases a cloud of sulfur dioxide that drifts across Europe for months, creating what contemporary observers call a dry fog. Crop failures follow. The winter of 1783-84 is one of the harshest on record in Europe. The death toll, while difficult to calculate, is significant. But here is what the official account of the Laki eruption doesn't explain. The dry fog of 1783 is observed in regions that should have been well upwind of an Icelandic eruption. Accounts from Russia, from the Middle East, from North Africa describe similar atmospheric phenomena in the same period. The distribution of the dry fog is, in the words of contemporary observers, wider than the wind pattern explains. 1784, widespread crop failures across the Northern Hemisphere, not in Iceland's immediate vicinity, globally. 1785 to 1786. Multiple independent accounts from Europe, Russia, and North America of blood-colored moons, orange midday suns, a quality of light described as wrong, as altered, as having a character that observers had no vocabulary to describe because they had never seen it before. 1815, the eruption of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. 1816 becomes the year without a summer, global crop failures, famine. The atmospheric signature of Tambora is global and undeniable. The official narrative places 1783's Laki eruption in the same category as 1815's Tambora, a major volcanic event with regional to global atmospheric consequences. Natural, terrible but natural. But the distribution of the 1781-786 atmospheric record doesn't match a single volcanic event. It matches multiple simultaneous events of enormous scale, distributed across the Northern Hemisphere, producing a cascade of atmospheric disturbance that takes years to resolve. Or it matches one event of a kind we're not allowed to contemplate. What is the atmospheric signature of a civilization being destroyed? I don't mean metaphorically, I mean physically. What does the air look like when a population center, or multiple population centers of sufficient scale are simultaneously obliterated? When the infrastructure of a civilization, its cities, its manufacturing, its energy sources, whatever those energy sources might have been, is catastrophically destroyed over a period of weeks or months. We know what nuclear winter looks like in theory because we have modeled it. Massive particulate injection into the atmosphere, temperature drops, light reduction, agricultural collapse, effects lasting years. We assume no such thing was possible in 1780. But that assumption is based on our understanding of what technology existed in 1780. And our understanding of what technology existed in 1780 is based on official histories that, if Tartaria was real, are incomplete. What if the civilization that appeared on every European map for 3 centuries had capabilities we haven't accounted for? Not science fiction capabilities, not anachronistic nonsense, but engineering capabilities, energy capabilities, material capabilities that were more advanced than the European empires of the 18th century, and that, in their destruction, left an atmospheric signature that looked like natural disaster because we had no framework to interpret it as anything else. The dark day is not evidence of this, I want to be clear. The dark day, standing alone, is explicable as an unusual but natural atmospheric event. The atmospheric record of 1780 to 1786, taken as a whole, is harder to explain but still within the range of coincidental natural disaster. What makes it significant is the context. The name disappearing from maps, the buildings without construction records, the population transitions without documentation, the institutional silence about questions that should have easy answers. The atmospheric record is one thread, pull it together with the others, and the pattern that emerges is not comfortable. Part 7. What the maps were hiding. I want to spend time on the maps specifically, because this is where the evidence is most concrete and most ignored. The first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1771, contains an entry on Tartary that reads, Tartary, a vast country in the northern parts of Europe and Asia, extending from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, bounded by Siberia on the north and west, and by China on the east. Eastern Tartary is under the domination of China. The Western Tartary, or independent Tartary, is peopled by several hordes of savages. Even in this condescending colonial language, note what is being described. A vast country, not a vague geographic label, a country with a western portion that is independent, not under any empire's dominion, in 1771. 9 years before the Dark Day. By the time the third edition of the Britannica appears in the 1790s, the entry on Tartary is contracted. The language shifts, it becomes more vague. The independent portion is no longer independent, it's being absorbed. By the fourth edition in the early 1800s, the entry is largely historical in character. Tartary as a present-day political or geographic reality is fading from the scholarly record even as it's fading from the maps. The change in the encyclopedia tracks the change in the cartography, tracks the window of the Dark Day, and the subsequent atmospheric events of the 1780s. Now look at the maps from a different angle. Look at what gets drawn in the territories formerly labeled Tartary after the name disappears. You get two things primarily: Russian imperial territory pushing steadily east and south, and blank space, lots of blank space. For a region that had been consistently labeled and discussed for centuries, suddenly the interior of Central Asia and Siberia becomes cartographically uncertain in a way that shouldn't be possible given the level of exploration and mapping that had been occurring. It's as if the mapmakers knew something was there before 1780 and weren't sure what to do with it after. The blank spaces in post-1780 cartography of Central Asia are not the blank spaces of unexplored territory. They're the blank spaces of something that has been removed, but whose absence hasn't yet been filled with a replacement narrative. And in those blank spaces, if you look at the emerging archaeological record of the 19th and early 20th centuries, before the Russian imperial and then Soviet academic establishment had fully consolidated control of the narrative, you find ruins, extensive ruins, cities of stone, in regions where the official historical record says only nomadic peoples ever lived. Infrastructure, roads, irrigation systems, foundations that predate the arrival of the empires that supposedly settled those territories. Official archaeology explains these ruins as the remnants of earlier steppe civilizations, the Scythians, the Sogdians, the Khwarezmian Empire, real historical peoples, real historical states, slotted into the archaeological record to provide an explanation for the physical evidence without allowing the physical evidence to suggest anything more recent. But the dating of these ruins in many cases relies on the absence of contradicting evidence rather than the presence of confirming evidence. We know the Sogdian trading cities existed in Central Asia, therefore these ruins must be Sogdian. The logic is circular. The physical evidence could support a different interpretation. The institutional framework doesn't allow that interpretation to be explored. What if those ruins aren't ancient? What if some of them are 18th century, or nearly so? What if the ancient civilizations of the Silk Road are, in some cases, the physical remnant of Tartaria? The timeline would work, the ruins would work, the blank spaces on the maps would work. What doesn't work is the consensus. The institutional consensus that says this question is not worth asking. Part 8. The coordination problem. Here is the argument I find most difficult to dismiss. The neoclassical architectural style appears simultaneously across Europe, North America, Russia, and parts of Asia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This is documented, acknowledged, celebrated in official art history. The explanation is cultural diffusion, shared Enlightenment ideals, the influence of key texts and the grand tour on the European architectural establishment, and then colonial export of European style to the rest of the world. That explanation requires several things to be true simultaneously. It requires cultural diffusion to have worked faster than it has ever worked in any other documented case. Architectural styles don't normally spread across continents in a generation. Gothic took centuries to diffuse across Europe. Baroque took generations. Rococo was a French phenomenon that influenced Europe but never fully crossed the Atlantic. Yet neoclassicism appears in Washington, St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, and Calcutta within decades, with such uniformity that the buildings are nearly interchangeable. It requires the Grand Tour, an educational tradition available to wealthy young European men, to have somehow transmitted a highly specific technical vocabulary of construction, not just aesthetic preference but the actual engineering knowledge required to build in this style, to builders across cultures that had no access to the Grand Tour tradition. American frontier cities, Australian colonial settlements, Russian imperial expansion zones. The Grand Tour doesn't explain how the neoclassical style got there. It only explains how European elites developed an appreciation for it. And it requires the technical knowledge of classical construction to have been reconstructed from ancient ruins in the space of a few decades after being lost for centuries. The medieval period in official art history represents a break in the classical tradition. The great Roman buildings were not being replicated in the 10th century or the 12th century. The knowledge had to be recovered. And the official story is that the Renaissance began this recovery and the Enlightenment completed it, such that by the late 18th century, architects had fully reconstructed the classical vocabulary and were applying it globally. But reconstruction from ruins is a slow process. It is experimental. It produces variations, failures, approximations. It does not produce the immediate, confident, globally uniform expression of neoclassicism that we see in the inheritance period. Unless it wasn't reconstruction. Unless what the architects of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were doing was not reconstructing a lost tradition, but inheriting a living one. What if the neoclassical buildings that appear with such suspicious speed and uniformity across the world were already there? What if the architectural tradition that produced them wasn't lost and rediscovered but continuous, until it was abruptly ended? The coordination problem dissolves if there's a common source. If the buildings predate the civilizations that claimed them, then the uniformity is explained, the speed is explained, the technical perfection is explained, the missing documentation is explained. The coordination problem only exists if you accept the premise that these buildings were built when official history says they were built. Remove that premise and the evidence is consistent with something else entirely. Part 9, What I Believe and What I Can't Prove. I want to be honest with you here because I think honesty is the thing that's most missing from this conversation, on all sides. I cannot prove Tartaria was a unified global civilization. I cannot prove the Dark Day was caused by its destruction. I cannot prove the great buildings of the 19th century were inherited rather than constructed. I cannot prove that the simultaneous erasure of Tartary from maps, the atmospheric events of the 1780s, and the inheritance period of architecture are connected rather than coincidental. What I can prove is that the official explanations are inadequate. I can prove that 150,000 square miles of midday darkness cannot be explained by the documented forest fires of the period. I can prove that Tartary disappears from cartography without the explanatory documentation that every other cartographic revision of the period includes. I can prove that major 19th century civic buildings lack the construction documentation that exists for lesser projects of the same era. I can prove that the distribution of the neoclassical style defies normal patterns of cultural diffusion. And I can prove that when you ask these questions in academic contexts, the response is dismissal rather than refutation. Dismissal is not an answer, it's a strategy. So let me be precise about what I believe and why. I believe Tartaria was real, not as a vague geographic label, but as a civilization, or a confederation of civilizations, that occupied vast territories across Eurasia and possibly beyond. I believe this civilization was sophisticated enough to build on the scale we see in the architectural inheritance. I believe it was extensive enough and organized enough to appear on every major European map for centuries. I believe it ended in the late 18th century, abruptly enough to leave a visible atmospheric signature, and quickly enough to leave its infrastructure intact for claiming. I believe the years from 1780 to 1820 represent a deliberate erasure of the name from maps, of the records of construction from the official archive, of the cultural memory of a civilization that the inheriting powers could not afford to acknowledge. I believe this because the alternative, the coincidence theory, requires too many coincidences aligned in too narrow a window with too consistent a result. And I believe the question is worth asking not because I need to be right about the answer, but because the quality of the official response to the question tells us something important about the quality of the official history we've been given. When the answer to a sincere historical question is ridicule, something is being protected. When the documentation for major public buildings is missing, it was removed or it never existed. When a name that appeared on every map for centuries disappears in decades without explanation, the explanation was suppressed. I might be wrong about Tartaria. I might be pattern matching across genuinely coincidental data. I might be doing exactly what the skeptics say, finding a narrative that explains everything by being unfalsifiable. But I don't think I'm wrong about the questions, and I don't think the questions have been answered. Part 10, the evidence still standing. Here's what I want you to do. Go to your nearest major city. Find the oldest civic building, not the newest glass tower. The old one, the courthouse, the customs house, the city hall, the train station, the exhibition building, the public library. The one with the columns and the dome and the stonework and the proportions that feel somehow larger than they should. Look at it, really look at it. Ask yourself, could this have been built when they say it was built, with the tools that existed, with the workforce that's documented, in the time that the plaque on the wall claims? Then find the construction records, the blueprints filed with the city, the supply chain documentation, the photographs of the building going up, the contemporary accounts of the labor force that erected it. See how far you get. In most cases, you will find the dedication plaque. You will find the official opening. You will find the name of the architect of record. You may find a painting done decades later, depicting the construction in romanticized terms. What you will struggle to find is the kind of thorough, contemporaneous, independently verifiable documentation of the construction process that should exist for a building of this scale built in an era of increasing record-keeping and photography. The absence is not proof, but it is a question. And while you're looking, while you're standing in front of that building, notice the stonework, notice the proportions, notice the acoustic quality of the interior spaces, the way sound moves through the great halls as if the building understands sound in a way that modern architecture rarely achieves. Notice how permanent it looks, how permanent it feels. Not like something that was thrown up quickly to impress a visiting dignitary or mark a national milestone, but like something built to last not decades but centuries. Built by someone who expected to still be there in centuries. Who expected their civilization to continue. Who didn't know they were building something another civilization would inherit. The stone doesn't lie, it can't. It holds the record of what it was made for even when the paper records have been altered or removed. And the stone across thousands of buildings, across a dozen countries, across a generation of supposed rapid construction says, we were not built quickly, we were not built in a hurry. We were built by a culture that had been building this way for a long time, that had refined its technique over generations, that understood its materials the way you only understand something after centuries of working with it. That's not the 19th century speaking. The 19th century is a young civilization in a hurry, building in cast iron and steel and brick, cutting corners where it can, moving fast, building for function first and form second. The classical buildings of the inheritance period were not built by the 19th century. They were found by it. Coda, the sky that remembers. May 19th, 1780. The darkness arrives like a wall, like a curtain being drawn, not gradually, not the slow thickening of smoke on the horizon, suddenly, as if someone reached up and turned off the sun. In the Connecticut legislature, Colonel Davenport refuses to adjourn. If this is the day of judgment, he says, I choose to be found at my post. In farmhouses across New England, families gather by candlelight at noon and wait. Animals huddle, birds stop singing. The night sounds begin, the crickets, the frogs, the creatures of darkness, triggered by a darkness that has no business being there. And the moon, when it finally rises, is red, the color of blood, the color of copper, the color of something burning far away, something massive, something that has been burning for days or weeks or longer, something whose smoke has finally arrived on winds from wherever it came from. What was burning? Official history says, forests, unnamed forests in unnamed locations, generating unnamed quantities of smoke that behaved in ways forest fire smoke has never behaved before or since. What I say, I don't know, I can't know. The evidence was buried too deep and too long ago, but I know that the official answer is wrong, or at minimum, incomplete. I know that the world changed in those years, that names disappeared from maps, that cities appeared without being built, that a civilization that had been there long enough to be cartographically documented for centuries was gone without leaving a survivor's account, a refugee record, a cultural remnant that anyone has been permitted to seriously investigate. I know the sky went dark. I know the world that emerged from that darkness was different from the world that entered it, I know that someone worked very hard to make sure the world that emerged would not ask too many questions about the world that came before. And I know that stone doesn't lie. The buildings are still there. The questions are still there. The sky on May 19th, 1780 went black at noon. And when the light came back, a civilization was missing. If you felt this wrongness in the official timeline, if you've stood in front of one of these buildings and known, in some way that precedes argument, that the story you were told doesn't fit the thing in front of you, leave a comment. Tell me your city, tell me the building, tell me what you noticed. The investigation doesn't end here, it starts here. Because someone worked very hard to make us forget, and everything they worked to make us forget is still standing. In stone, waiting for the right questions. What happened to Tartaria? What darkened the sky in 1780? And who decided we shouldn't ask? Subscribe, this goes much deeper.